All right, so I'm going to talk to you guys about understanding your field somewhat, and mostly about application risk management. So understanding, what's high risk, what's low risk, and how do we work within that, what tools do we have for that, etc. So the first thing is, and for any of you that have come to one of our speaker series and heard me talk, you've probably seen this slide before, but I'm going to reiterate some of these things for you. So factors that lead to a pollution event. These things are pretty obvious, but they kind of set the context for a lot of the tools we develop and bringing together things we talked about today. So first of all, pollutant availability. It has to be there. If we've applied in excess, if we haven't kind of followed some of the rules and guidelines we've talked about so far today, then it's available for movement wherever that may be. Surface water, groundwater, into the air, wherever it's going to go, if it's going to stay in your soil type. Usually if we have some type of improper manure application timing, application rates, method, and or improper grazing practices, that means that it's somewhere it shouldn't be and it has the potential to become a pollutant rather than a nutrient. Weather events, of course you need some type of catalyst to make this happen. Precipitation, flooding, high water table, wind, any of those variables will, again, if that nutrient's just, sitting somewhere in your soil, it's probably innocuous until we get something like a big rain or a wind or something like that to move it somewhere it shouldn't go. So having that event, and then poor field conditions. If you've got challenging soil type that is saturated soils is one of the biggest ones, frozen ground, kind of a steep slope on your hillside, improper surface cover, there's not a lot there. Any of those field conditions can also help prompt or encourage a nutrient to become a pollutant. So thinking of these few things, is it available? Was it applied improperly? Was there a catalyst, a weather event, and was your field incapable of actually, retaining that on that field condition? So these are the things to think about, and it comes back, I told you this would come back at you. In particular, when we talk about this improper application practices, did we violate one of these things? Did we miss one of these? Did we just have a bad day? Did something happen? Whatever it may be, is one of these timing, placement, rate, or source out of rhyme. And so we've created a way to kind of help you put all these things together in a way that also ties a lot of the other things we've talked about today. But first of all, let's talk about what makes your field high risk. We talk about high risk application timing. That's going to go along with weather events for the most part. We talk about high risk for runoff. That means anywhere, well, it could be any month of the year here in Western Washington, you never know. But in general, October through about March, we call high risk just because the amount of precipitation we get, when we get it, how we get it. That makes runoff a challenge if your field has that. So what makes your field a high-risk field? Well, a lot of these things are pretty darn obvious, right? You have water adjacent to your field. And not only is there water adjacent, but your field slope into that. You may have a field where you may have water adjacent, but the field actually kind of slopes up to it. Whether that's over time it's had that way, whether you did that on purpose. So that may not be as much of an issue for runoff from your field into that water body. But in many cases, irrigation ditches, drainage ditches here purposefully were created that water would run off your field into those and get away, and or you've got tiles in those fields to try to do the same thing. So historically, a lot of the things that were done for you to get water off of your field so that you could farm it are now seen as a potential pathway for pollutants or something to get somewhere. So you just have to be a little bit more vigilant about those things. Is there a slope to a waterway or a conduit? So you may not think, you're like, oh, there's a ditch, yeah, it's 2 fields away, but that field kind of slopes to a swale, and that swale goes all that way. You can think of that swale pretty much just like a drainage ditch. For the most part, anything that you apply and it rains and it gets in that swale, enough rain, it's just going to push it like a river right out to that water body. So that's an area that could be a high-risk area, somewhere of concern you want to be noted. High water table. this is a concern during the time of year when, you know, this comes up. We're looking at, you know, December, February, you know, all of that time period when that water table, we get enough rain and it comes up. That means that, as Troy just talked about, your field doesn't have the capacity to infiltrate any more water. So you may not see it right at the surface. Let's say that water table is 6 inches or a foot down, but if you put a few inches of manure by volume liquid on there, it may not be able to get into there, so it's just going to sit on top. So that high water table can be a real challenge. And that's from a surface standpoint. From a leaching standpoint, if we've got that water table that it comes up and it can grab whatever's in that top foot of the soil, and then it's going to go right back down and take it with it, sometimes that's how we see that nitrate leaching. If our timing of manure application isn't kind of married up with when we know that water table comes up and down. So that's a factor that can make your field high risk, is that seasonal high water table. Obviously, if you're in a floodplain or you're in a field that will flood due to a water body, this could be a one-time deal, a beaver dam, a sediment dam that builds up, poor drainage in the ditches, you've got grass built up and everything else, and that could cause a backup and cause your field to flood. That may only happen once, but if that happened right after a manure application event, that water floods back onto your field, and then when that dam or whatever it may be, that kind of water starts moving down that ditch, all that water goes right back with it. What is that? Is that a pollution event? You know, this is something, it's kind of a little bit nebulous there, but these are things to be concerned about. Are you next to, you've got a water body, fish trap, double ditch, so many others in our county that a little bit of high water and it just kind of goes right over the edges into your field and back. Those are areas that you want to note as those are high-risk areas. As well as you have a ponded area, there's always a low spot in your field. Maybe it doesn't drain anywhere, but it's somewhere you want to note so you don't tear up your field, lead to compaction issues if you're going over that area that you know is softer or wetter than other areas in your field. So that would also be a high-risk area. Your soil type could make your field high risk. So think about today what we've heard about these different soil types and their challenges with water holding capacity. That's a good thing from an irrigation standpoint in some cases, but those are those fields that you're waiting and waiting and waiting to get out on because you can't, because they're holding so much water. So those are the ones maybe that saturate really fast, your clay-based soils or those types of things that you can't get out on because they're saturated so quick and so easily. So that can make it high risk. As I mentioned, kind of this available water holding capacity and soil saturation, what is that, the available capacity in your soil at that time to actually take a manure application event? You may think, oh, I'm just going to pull my big gun out, I won't have compaction issues. But if that can't get in there, it's going to have a runoff event. So those are those kind of heavier soils that can be a problem there. Permeability rate. This can actually make if you have a very sandy, super well-drained soil, that's great, but it can also make your field high risk from a leaching standpoint. So our fields that drain really well, that are great for reduction of runoff, are our highest risk leaching fields that we have. So got a little bit of a flip there. And then of course cover. If you have no cover on your field, if it's fallow, that's a higher risk because you don't have all that vegetation to stop runoff, to stop sediment, and it's just going to flow right off. If you've got a grass field with maybe 50% cover on there, let's say, it's just not looking good, or it's a new seeding and you put manure on there and you get a rain event, it's going to flow off that field with low cover much easier than a field with a nice dense cover. So the more grass you have, the denser it is. As water is trying to flow across the surface, it keeps hitting all of that grass and it stops, or that grass will hold all that sediment or nutrient back from being able to get off that field. So a nice dense forage stand is really good for reducing any kind of a runoff issue. So these are some things that make your field a high-risk field, things to think about that you probably already know very well about your field. Some of these things are long-term, nothing you can do about it. Some of them you can do something about. So now let's kind of match this up a little bit with manure application timing. Let's think about our just 3 basic classes of soils. We've got our sandy soils, our clay soils, and our silt soils. And Doug talked a little bit about some of their major properties: infiltration and drainage, permeability, runoff, compaction. And then when we think of manure application, I've now put kind of a broad range of dates on these for when we actually want to get out there for manure application, and why is that. So with sandy soils, as I mentioned, what we're most worried about with these, our biggest kind of high risk time, is we have a high leaching rate potential in the fall. So after, when we start getting a lot of rain, September, October, that field, if whatever's left, it's probably going to go right through. Our clay-based soils, we're most concerned about runoff rate in the spring. When those things saturate, anything that goes on top, your water holding capacity is, maxed out, and you're probably saturated in a lot of other things, and that's what we're worried about. You put manure on there and you get a little bit of rain and it can just shoot right off. And then our silt soils, these are all your soils kind of in the middle, if you remember that pyramid that Doug showed. And this is, we're a little bit more concerned about our runoff in the fall and the spring in particular. So on both ends of that spectrum, runoff is going to be a bit more of an issue as things start saturating, or we just get a large volume of rain and that soil can't take all of that water in fast enough. Even when it's a little bit dry, it takes a little while to saturate that. It's like a sponge, right? It kind of takes its time before it can really hold that water, and then you hit some point and it's oversaturated and the water just runs right off. So you can really think about all these different soil types are kind of like different sponge types. So if we think about this and we think about our sandy soils in particular, these are our nice well-drained soils. You probably don't have a lot of these, maybe you do if you're very lucky in certain areas. You may have one or two fields that kind of are in this lower risk soil type, I'll call this, for runoff. And these are our fields that we talked about application from January through about August. So when the weather's good, that's when we want to stop in August. There's no real benefit to your grass after that time period. In fact, by pushing a lot more nitrogen into your grass after that period, you can actually encourage growth instead of starch root storage, and you can actually have winter kill a little bit easier in those soil types. So not pushing at the end, it has plenty to get it through with that slow manure conversion rate that we've talked about. Most likely it's going to get by just fine. If we look at silt, that could be anywhere from that January through October. It's really predicated on what type of a silt mix. Is it sand silt? You're probably a little bit in that earlier season. If it's a clay-based silt combo, you're probably in the later. And then clay-based soils, you probably can't get out till April or later, and you're there through November. And so these are kind of those dates with forage. When we look at corn, you guys are really set on timing on that. Everything's about the same with that. We're March, April-ish, whenever that activity gets going. So when we think about these dates, these are very much so for forage. When we do think about corn, hopefully every one of you is planting cover crops to minimize all of your losses during the winter period, whether that's leaching losses, so whatever nitrogen's left over, if you can get a cover crop on there, it keeps it from leaching through, it holds it in there. As well as if you have a fallow field, you're going to get all that sediment loss. If that's going right into a ditch and you're having to clean that out, and that's thousands of dollars, it's a lot cheaper to plant a cover crop that will help prevent that sediment loss, as well as now you've got this great extra source of feed if you're able to harvest said cover crop. Some folks will kill it off, that's fine, as long as you've got something there through the winter to stabilize your soil and keep some of those nutrients from being lost around the pond. So these are kind of these different time frames, and in your fields, in your farm, is going to be very specific. And so I want to talk a little bit about something called application risk management that some of you may have heard, some of you may already be participating in this program. Some of you maybe have never heard of this at all. And so this is a program over at the Conservation District that we're developing. We've been working on it the last few years, and we're like just right to the point now where it's going to kind of be open and available for most everyone. At this point, we've been on kind of an ask basis and working with folks individually. But it's essentially, it's a few different steps. And you got a handout that goes over some of this. But essentially, if you want to apply manure, here's a couple of really basic steps. Number one, determine agronomic rate. Make sure, yes, I should be out there, and if so, how much. We already got that covered. You've got some information on that today. The next 3 steps are what we've kind of put together. It's identifying those optimal, that low risk field. You probably already know what fields all of those are. We're just able to verify that with some mapping and give you a little bit of extra guidance on some of those hot spots that we talked about. And then this is kind of the unique part here, is determine current conditions using a manure spreading advisory and seasonal manure setbacks. A lot of you in your old farm plans, you may have 35 or 40 feet on every ditch, everywhere, every minute of every day of the year. And now it's between 10 and 80. We're asking you, can we accordion this throughout the year such that in the summertime, very low risk times, you get maximum application on that field for production. If you give us in the winter time or high risk times, give us 80 feet for that insurance policy that you're going to need just to prevent having any of those issues. You're not going to need that extra nutrients in high risk times on that outer part of that field. So we now kind of have this flux, and I'll show you a little bit more on that. And then of course we've got a ARM worksheet. This is the heart of what we're doing. This is that field by field individual assessment to know, can I get out there today or not? And of course applying and monitoring your fields when all this is done. And I'm going to talk mostly about doing this during high-risk times, January, February, especially that September, October, November, if that kind of happens. This year we had some odd weather that predicated for November applications, and so essentially what you may kind of notice here is a lot of you guys are used to TSIM 200 February 15th to the October 15, October 30, and I'm not talking about dates at all anymore. So I want you to get dates out of your head and apply when it's appropriate. Does that mean you can apply in December? Probably not. So, but what I want you to do is apply on the appropriate schedule for each of your fields when it needs it. That's the most important part. And so it's going to kind of play up again and again to all the factors we've talked about today. So what does this look like? The first one is that agronomic rate. Do you need nutrients in December? No. So that's never probably going to come up as a number one. Do you need nutrients in April? Yes. Where do you count back to make sure that manure is going to apply it in April? So we have to use that knowledge about manure. I need in April, chemical fertilizer, you can apply them, manure you need to apply ahead of time. So that's where we talk about this January, February, or whatever it is for those early time periods. And accounting for those losses as well. So you can just use rule of thumb, and it's going to vary 40% loss. So if you apply 100 pounds of nitrogen, about 60% or 60 pounds is going to be available to your crop coming up soon. Some of that's going to be held in the soil, some of it's going to be lost to the air or wherever it is. So we can kind of use that as a rough kind of rule of thumb. And the difference here, of course, between waste disposal and nutrient management is getting this balance right. Just don't go out and put 100, or 20,000 pounds per acre, or 20,000 gallons per acre because that's what you did last year and that's what you always do. Just do a little math before you go out. That's all we ask, or at least, split. Oh, I need 400 pounds of nitrogen for the year because I've got a 6-ton grass crop. I'm going to split it up 5 cuttings, yada, yada, yada. So just do a little bit of that, and then you can figure this out, especially if you've got your nitrogen test for your manures. We talked about that changes throughout the year. So having that available, those quick tests, very valuable to know, oh, I've got 10 pounds per 1,000 gallons, or I've got 20 pounds per 1,000 gallons. That's going to half your rate of your application rate if you know which one of those. So very important to have that information. So some of this risk mapping, as I talked about, this is something that if you're interested, your planner at the Whatcom Conservation District, whoever you've been working with, can help you work through this. If you don't have a planner there, just give me a call and I'll help get started. But it essentially looks like this. So you've got somewhere between red, which are high risk, and blue, which are low risk. This just happens to be an example farm that has a little bit of everything. You may have all high risk fields. It is entirely possible you are in a place that you just have high risk soils. You may have all low risk soils. That would be a good place. And when we think about runoff versus leaching, our runoff categories, high to low, are about opposite of our leaching. So again, those fields that we think about, where do I want to go in October, not the same as the fields you'd go out to in January, for instance. And if you think about, this is our entire county here, and this is just a rough risk. So again, red is high risk, blue is the lowest risk, rainbow order. All the red dots are dairy facilities, and the green hash, you can kind of see, are the dairy fields. So generally, what kind of fields do we have here in the county that are low risk? And I just highlighted in red what our low risk fields are. So it's really only about 23-ish% of our fields are that low, medium, low that would qualify for that January application time period. So you may have one 10-acre field. You may be someone who's lucky and has 100 acres of the stuff, or who knows. So we have a lot of high-risk fields in this county just due to the soil type, or where they are, or they're adjacent to water. There just happens to be a lot of high-risk fields in our county. So it's really important. And then there's a lot of just this medium that could go either way, totally depending on the year and what we've got going. So a lot of variation here in our county and what we've got. So it's nice to know what you've got on your individual farm. So some of the tools that we've got here, the first one and the most important one, and hopefully a lot of you, who has seen the manure spreading advisory and or used it? A couple of you, not a lot. Okay, well great, this is your chance to know what am I talking about. Okay, so I'm going to show you, so the manure spreading advisory, so on those little cards that you have that I passed out earlier is the web address to find this, wadairyplan.org. Everything you could need, we keep referencing stuff, it's all up here. Every one of the guides that someone has referenced, Andy Berry referenced a lot, they're all up on here. So everything is here. This manure spreading advisory in particular, you can also find it on the Whatcom Conservation District webpage. And if you're in Whatcom County, you'll probably want to go to the Whatcom Conservation District because you've got just a little extra feature on here. But essentially, you'll see we've done this for the whole Puget Sound. So no matter where you are in the Puget Sound, you can find this. And you just want to kind of zoom in to where your farm is approximately. Let's say you're in North Linden here. And all you do on the map, you can click on the map, and you can see right now everything is green. That means it's low risk right now for our weather conditions. It may not mean that your field can take it. This is just for a runoff advisory. So you can see currently right now, we've got 0 for the 24-hour precip forecast and 0.02 for the 72-hour, and it comes down. So this gives you a 3-day risk. It's low today, it's low tomorrow, and then it goes up to medium. So this is a nice way for you to be able to pull this up and say, oh, I should call the custom guy. You know, get him out here now. A lot of times this will be flipped. So it's high risk today, and you're like, oh, look, in 2 days, it's a low risk. That's a great time for me to maybe start getting things scheduled or start looking at my field. So this is a nice way for you to be able to access that. 2 other things on this that are really nice and valuable for you to use. You'll notice this NOAA weather link. If you want to see the coolest, I think, weather website, if you click on this, it'll take you to the NOAA website for that zone that you're in. And I don't know how well you can see this, but this actually gives you temperature, chance of precipitation. It gives you the 6-hour blocks for precipitation amount for each day. So you can see when those big blocks of rain are coming. This might help you on a daily activity. Say, oh, I'm going to get a little rain this morning. It's going to clear up, or vice versa. So you know what's going on, as well as the wind speed. So if you're using a big gun, today would be a good day, tomorrow would be terrible. So these are kind of nice ways to look at this for your crop production, for irrigation scheduling. This is a really nice website. And again, you can find that right off of that manure spreading advisory by clicking that NOAA weather link tab. As well as a lot of times of the year, I'll give you, like this time of year, it's not really important. I won't give a lot of guidance, but higher risk times starting January here soon, February, and that October time period, I'll give you a lot of guidance. Over here, a little just daily kind of update. This is what things are looking at. Big event coming, watch out, or be sure this is your setback for this time of year, etc. Lots of information up there, as well as the current manure application setback distance. So all of this stuff is right there. Again, you can also access that exact same information from that dairy website. You can also get this on your phone. There's a mobile-based version of this that if you just click right here, click here if you're accessing from a mobile device. So you can get that as well. So the next piece I talked about were these manure application setback distances. I'm going to go back to that web page because they are on here as well. So you just click manure application setback distances and you can see what those are and what month, and they're on that sheet as well that I gave you. So again, as I talked about, it's kind of this range, you know, this 10 foot approximately. If you're using a big gun, it's always 40 feet because of drift. So you can't put your big gun 10 feet from the edge because most likely it's going to go farther than that. You always have a little bit of a spray drift. So the end of your spray needs to be 40 feet. 10 feet otherwise for your other applications, and then about September we asked to bump up to 40, and then to 80, all the way through February about 40, April, March and April, and then back down. So this year again on the real-time advisory I kind of sometimes keep those up. This year 10 feet in April was not appropriate. We were still getting a ton of rain. So we still want you to be back that 40 feet. So this is just a way that, you know, this is based on scientific kind of research and everything else, so it is pretty valid, and it keeps it going. And this is for both liquid and solid manure, by the way. So both of those things apply for all of this information. And then the ARM worksheet, as I mentioned. So this is what pulls all of these things together. And you can access the ARM worksheet right from the manure spreading advisory. So you just click on there and it says ARM worksheet, and this is what that is. So this is actually a really nice tool for you. So once you figure out, okay, generally the weather looks good and I can apply, now I want to know for a specific field, what is my risk for applying? Maybe it's a cluster of fields. A cluster would be they're all the same soil type and hazards and conditions and those types of things. And you're going to go through this and you're going to enter in, you know, your farm name and the date, what field you want to apply to, and then here's that, you know, what's the precipitation, and you can get that right off of that manure spreading advisory for how much is that going to be. And as you go through, it's going to give you a little bit of guidance on these things. What's your soil moisture? You've got that great guide that Troy passed out to help you. That's probably the hardest thing on here to figure out. You get the forecast, that's easy. What's your soil type? That should be on your maps. If you don't have a map, get a map updated. And then you saw some tools from Doug on different ways. There's an app, you can stand there in your field and figure it out. The soil moisture is probably the hardest thing to figure out. The next thing, what's the water table depth? You can figure that out from different landscapes, etc. If you need help, we can always come out and kind of walk through a field with you and help kind of identify and understand these things. What's your forage density? So how thick is your grass stand out there? What's the height of that? This matters. If it's too short and you want to apply manure and then we're going to get a lot of rain, it just has a greater chance to run right over there. You want a grass stand that's at least 3 inches or higher. Most of your, you know, kind of cutting instrumentation is going to leave it at about that height or greater. And then field condition. This is just, do you have ponding, flooding, frozen fields, tiles? Are any of these things there? And if so, if it says, you said yes, there's flooding, it's going to say, don't apply. You know, so there's a little bit of like, you know, an idiot override in here. I don't expect that to be an issue, but so let's say it's none of the above there. What type of equipment are you using? This just is on here. If you click irrigation, it just gives you a little bit of feedback about watch out for this or for that. The likelihood of having an issue is maybe a little bit higher. And then do you have a water body nearby? If so, what setback are you using right now? Do you have a vegetative buffer, yes or no? And in the end, what it's going to give you is a risk rating for that field. And what you'll notice here too is as we went through this process, if you remember Sherry's presentation this morning about what types of things that you need for record keeping, and there's a handout, this fulfills a lot of that, except for how much did you apply, but you've got what field, what was the weather, what are your field conditions. So printing this out at the end is a great record keeping tool. Then you just write on there how much did you apply. So a really nice way, and then you know what's that risk rating for that field. And if you want to apply in January, you want to apply at a time that's outside of the normal windows. This is a nice way to have that record to show, hey, I did my due diligence, I did my assessment, here's my form, I'm good to go. So this is a great way, and just because this also gives you great flexibility for that. It gives you accountability that if this says high and you apply and you have a discharge, you knowingly went out and applied on the high field. So you do have that accountability and responsibility in that vein as well. So we give you some balance here. So if you do have any questions about that, just give me a call at the Conservation District office. My card is in the back as well, so you can do that. And just really briefly, what can you do to minimize risk? Land application of manure, obviously know your soil test, you need manure. As I mentioned, injection and aeration is the best for high-risk seasons. Observe the forecast, watch for ponded areas, swale slopes, waterways, and follow application guidance. It's pretty much the same for solid manure. The only difference here is that if you're going to do infield storage piling, which is relatively discouraged, but if it's happening, just do it that our field's not in a floodplain, not within 100 feet of a water body, not within 500 feet of wells, not on a slope, not near neighbors, and not on well-drained soil. So we've got a lot of knots in there for those. As I mentioned, relay and cover crops do a great job for reducing sediment and leaching and nutrients. This is a very great way on corn-based fields to kind of get that little extra layer of winter protection and keep your soil where it is. You spend a lot of time building it, you might as well keep it. And then you could go a step further if the setbacks aren't working, you're having some issues still, you just have challenges. Stream buffers, if anyone went to our speaker series last month, Frank talked about these very small 15-foot hedgerows that are extremely effective in reducing drift if you use a big gun into a water body, helping limit some of that sediment inflow to there, as well as providing a lot of positive things for the stream, and mostly it's for drainage maintenance. No more drainage maintenance. It chokes out grass, there's nothing growing in there, and you'll probably never have to touch that thing ever again. So in fact, in a lot of cases, by planting these kind of dense, short hedgerows, they eliminate kind of drainage maintenance altogether on those. So you can save thousands of dollars. It's pretty incredible. So if you're ever interested in that, you can do it on short lengths, long lengths, work with your neighbors on building up a length. Frank Corey over in our office is a great person to talk to about that. And in most cases, you can get cost share and get this done for a very low price on your point. So it's pretty nice. And then if you're a grazing person, obviously, grazing is just direct manure application at a lower rate usually. So just do good rotations and fencings. Be smart about having setbacks for grazing, just as important as others. And then lastly, storage and clean water. So it's amazing how big of a difference this makes. When we talked earlier about, we always get dilution of manure at weird times and off times. The less clean water that you can get into your storage facility, the better, obviously, right? You don't want to be hauling clean water. You don't want to be diluting your manure early season. And just so you know, an area that's 100 feet by 100 feet, so 10,000 square feet, over the course of kind of our September to March period is almost 200,000 gallons of water you're collecting. That's maybe one area that you can fix a gutter on if it's your roof, or put a cover over a slab area that you collect, or just get rid of a slab area that you collect, try to re-fence. So there's different ways that you can really minimize those things, and it's a very big impact just getting rid of some clean water.